Hello, and welcome to Michael's Lens on Life project. We all live in the chaos of the quantum phone, and reality is, after all, what we perceive it to be individually. All probabilities for anything and everything coexist side by side in each and every moment. But in all cases, if our shared journey down the project rabbit hole pushes you to probe deeper into what we are looking at, or may push against your personal sense of reality, then welcome, my friend, to the quantum phone. You are looking through the lens on life. All things being equal, the simplest solution tends to be the best one. Occam's razor. When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Sherlock Holmes. Considering the absence of external injuries to the bodies and adding the conclusions of the medical examinations, it has to be concluded that the cause of their deaths was overwhelming force. Lev Ivanov, Dyatlov Incident Chief Investigator. Greetings, fellow voyagers, wherever you may be. This is Michael Lane with Michael's Lens on Life project. Our lens video presentation for this session is taking a look at a mysterious event that resulted in the deaths of 9 cross-country skiers in the former Soviet Union on February 1st, 1959. Now, when I say mystery in its association with this story, I do mean a human mystery in every sense of the word, specifically a traumatic event with a completely unexplained fatal outcome. I first became aware of the Dyatlov Pass incident when it was featured in a TV program, Unexplained Mysteries, some years ago. There was a segment on the program of why 9 experienced Russian ski hikers, in an apparent panic, abandoned their tent at night in the middle of harsh winter weather conditions on an isolated mountain located nearly 80 miles from the nearest village. All of the ski group died together in what can only be described as horrific circumstances. The Unexplained Mysteries narrative considered several possible explanations, including murder, natural events, paranormal influences, UFO phenomena, infighting, or animal attack. It was an incident with extraordinary photo documentation before and after the event, but with no real explanation as to the causes of why it had occurred. From then to now, a multitude of magazine articles summarized the unsolved mystery of the Dyatlov incident. The incident has also been featured in several cable television programs. Recently in Hollywood, film producer and director Renee Harlin had created a horror film called Devil's Pass, which effectively used elements of the Dyatlov incident to fuel the fictional storyline. It seemed that the story of the Dyatlov Pass incident, a story nearly 60 years old, was in the public eye everywhere and all at once. Out of curiosity, I began to dig into the story and found that I was, as were many others, absolutely hooked on the mystery. As I set about discovering the facts surrounding the mysterious circumstances of the Dyatlov ski hiking group, I focused on the written material from 3 primary research authors. Their books were grounded in serious investigation, with each delivering a different hypothesis as to what occurred on the night of February 1st on the slopes of Kholat-Syakhl in the Ural Mountains of Siberia. Each of the 3 authors, like Svetlana As, had met directly with or corresponded with surviving family members, and the original investigators of the event, making them unique resources. And in separate trips, two of them, Keith McCloskey and Donnie Icar, retraced the Dyatlov ski hike route as closely as possible. Here were 9 young, well-educated, and experienced individuals, young adults who were finishing their academic careers and preparing to start their professional careers. These were real flesh-and-blood people, not actors playing a role in a horror film. In the end, as I went down the rabbit hole, it became difficult for me to look at the photo images of the group celebrating their hike and then to match those images to the images of the frozen, desiccated, decaying corpses that were found on Kholat Syakhl. It really was the kind of story more fitting an outline for a Stephen King novel, but it had actually happened. As noted, the Dyatlov ski group photos were taken during the cross-country ski hike with several recovered cameras that were used by members of the hiking group. The snapshots, though casual, had been taken to provide the documentation to a committee back at the Ural Polytech Institute at Sverdlovsk that would help the group certify the difficulty of the ski hike, rated a Category 3, the highest degree of difficulty. The photos taken of the search and recovery effort and the examination of the hiking party's remains were taken by recovery team members and pathology teams from February 27th through May 12th, 1959. All photos taken by the hikers, the search and recovery teams, and the pathology teams are authentic. Departing from the Ural Polytech Institute at Sverdlovsk, Siberia, on January 23, 1959, were the 10 members of the Dyatlov cross-country ski hiking group consisting of 8 men and 2 women. The midwinter break from institute studies had been planned for several weeks. The downtime provided the students, all dedicated communist youth, with an approved vigorous activity in which they would be free to let their hair down and mix freely with their friends without official supervision. With one exception, the members of the hiking club were well known to each other. The exception was a 37-year-old veteran of World War II, Semyon Zolotaryov. But within days of joining the group, Semyon was warmly received, and the entire group was looking forward to the challenging excursion. Now, the idea of doing an extended cross-country ski hike to the northern Ural Mountains in the middle of the Russian winter sounds just plain crazy. At that time of year, the routine weather can be severe. The temperatures are routinely in the -10 to -30 degree Fahrenheit range, and strong winds with heavy snowfall are not unusual. It's not exactly a spring break environment like Fort Lauderdale, but these young adults were trained and experienced athletes and well adapted to the weather and the rigors of the strenuous trip before them. The Dyatlov group was one of several certified ski hiking clubs at the Institute, officially called ski tourist clubs. They routinely participated in what could be referred to as taking it to the edge outdoor activity. This particular hike was rated a Category 3, the highest degree of difficulty. It would be led by Igor Dyatlov, who, at age 23, was known to be a strong and experienced leader with a good sense of humor, but who required a no-nonsense level of discipline, safety, and camping hygiene with any of his hiking groups. For this excursion, the Dyatlov group would be taking a difficult route to Mount Otorten in the northern Ural Mountains. The hiking group would be passing through Mansi territory on their way to the mountain. The Mansi are an indigenous, rather nomadic tribe that have been settled in the Ural Mountains area of Siberia for many, many generations. The roughly translated Mansi name for Mount Otorten is "Don't Go There." and the name refers to it being a barren place that is no good for growing crops or hunting game. When they departed from the Institute on January 23, 1959, the Dyatlov hikers were healthy and fit, and they were all very experienced with mountain hiking and cross-country skiing. By Communist Party dictate, and with complete agreement from the group, there was absolutely no gender bias, and everybody carried appropriate weight and shared all tasks alike. The male members of the group would be carrying backpacks that weighed about 88 pounds each. The two women in the group would be carrying backpacks that weighed about 66 pounds each. The Dyatlov group were in high spirits, and they were well provisioned, and they knew exactly what was in front of them. From the Institute, they would travel north by rail to the towns of Serov and Ivdel. From Ivdel, they would travel by bus to the village of Vizhay. From Vizhay, they would go by open-bed truck to the Sector 41 camp, a state-controlled forestry settlement. At Sector 41, the group hired a local woodcutter and his horse and sleigh to transport their equipment and packs to an abandoned geology camp referred to as the Second Northern Site. Some of the group photos show the ski hikers leading the horse and sleigh to the Second Northern Site. From the Second Northern Site to Mount Otorten, and then back to the abandoned Second Northern Camp, they would be on their skis only and alone. One member of the group, 22-year-old Yuri Yudin, would drop out of the hike 5 days later, on January 28th, while at the Second Northern Site. Yudin was suffering a severe flare-up of chronic back pain from an old injury. Because of his decision to return home, Yuri Yudin would be the only surviving member of the hiking group. On January 28th, after affectionate goodbyes to Yuri Yudin, the remaining 9 hikers departed the Second Northern Site and continued their excursion to Mount Otorten. The 28th of January was also the last date that the Dyatlov group was seen alive. There are several photos of the group on their way from the Second Northern Site and moving single file along the Aspaya River toward another small mountain, Kholat Syakhl, meaning Dead Mountain, instead of Mount Otorten. There is no explanation given in the recovered group diary as to why there was a change in that route. The change in their hiking itinerary may have occurred as a result of weather conditions which were worsening during that last segment of the hike on February 1st. Dyatlov, as leader of the hiking group, would have been responsible for making the decision to change the route. Most likely, the change was his response to a weather safety issue after consultation with the other members of the group. It has also been suggested that the change in route reflected Dyatlov's desire to use the more difficult route to ensure the Category 3 certification. Kholat Syakhl, or Dead Mountain, sits next to Mount Otorten. Again, the name derives from the local Mansi tribe and means a place that is not suitable for hunting game or growing crops. The area between the two mountains is now called Dyatlov Pass. Some areas on Kholat Syakhl and Otorten are known to have spiritual significance to the Mansi and Ostyak people. The possible accidental infringement into a sacred area by the Dyatlov skiers figures prominently in one of the solution theories. In any event, the group stopped on the barren, dome-shaped slope of Kholat Syakhl, a few hundred yards below the summit and about a mile above a forested area, near the entrance to what would become known as Dyatlov Pass. With sunset occurring at about 5 p.m., they pitched the tent sometime around 4 p.m., prepared their meal, and then hunkered down for the night and a fresh start to Mount Otorten in the morning. There is no entry in the group diary for the evening of February 1st. At some point in the hours after 7 p.m., something horrific occurred, and members of the hiking group cut their way out of the tent in what could only have been a terrified, panicked response to something or someone outside the tent. The conditions on the mountain that night would have been pitch black, about 15 degrees below zero, with wind and blowing snow. Yet they all fled at the same time into the sub-zero snow and wind without proper clothing, leaving all of their belongings and food behind, and most were in stockinged or bare feet. In a matter of a few short hours, all would die of hypothermia, and several would exhibit severe internal injuries and facial disfigurement not solely associated with decomposition. Autopsy would establish that the internal wounds occurred while the victims were still alive. It was also established that the wounds were not the result of animal attack or predation, sharp objects, or gunshot wounds. When the hikers failed to return to Vizhay on the anticipated date of February 12th, the date Dyatlov was to have sent a telegram to the Institute verifying that they had started their return, a search party was formed, and on February 26, 1959, the hikers' tent was discovered. The tent was snow-covered and collapsed in the center section, but one end of the tent remained upright, ruling out crushing from an avalanche event. It appeared that the tent had been cut open from the inside out. For whatever the reason, the hikers had obviously left in a hurry, and all of their personal effects, clothing, and food remained. While not giving a lot of attention to it at the time, the group's shoes and hiking boots were jumbled together in a pile in the central area of the collapsed tent. With the discovery of the abandoned tent, the search effort enlarged and intensified significantly. On February 27th, downslope from the wrecked tent by nearly a mile, and just inside the edge of a forested area, the bodies of Georgy Krivonishenko and Yuri Doroshenko were found side by side under a cedar tree. It is probable that they were the first to die. There was evidence that a small fire had been started. The upper bodies of both men were lightly clothed, and their lower bodies were in their underwear. The hands and feet of both men were burned, most likely from their insertion into the fire while trying to warm themselves as they were freezing to death in the frigid temperature, wind, and swirling snow. There is speculation that the other members of the group were also present under the tree. Within an hour or so of arriving at the tree, Krivonishenko and Doroshenko had succumbed to hypothermia, and their bodies had been stripped of their outer clothing by the surviving members of the hiking party. If true, the removal of the outer clothing was a gesture of survival and not one of disrespect. The body of Igor Dyatlov was then recovered about 1,600 feet from the cedar tree, and then, in quick succession, the bodies of Rustem Slobodin and Zina Kolmogorova were found. The three bodies were nearly in a single-file straight line, separated from each other by 300 to 500 feet. The bodies were all lying upslope and head first toward the tent, as if they had been trying to get back to the tent. So the 5 bodies so far recovered through March 5th had all succumbed to hypothermia as the primary cause of death. But what no one could understand is why some, or perhaps all, of the Dyatlov group had cut their way out of the tent in sub-zero blizzard conditions and went into the night in dangerously harsh weather and without proper clothing. Now, this is probably a good point in the story to mention that one of the theories does suggest that the tent may have been breached from the outside and was not cut open from the inside by the hikers. More on that when we get to the theories of incident. Autopsies were performed, and the 5 bodies were returned to Sverdlovsk for further examination and burial. The first burial was in Sverdlovsk on March 9, 1959, for 4 of the hiking party. However, it would not be until May 3rd through the 5th, 1959, that the remaining bodies of Luda Dubinina, Alexander Kolovatov, Semyon Zolotaryov, and Nikolai Thibault-Brunel were recovered. The 4 hikers were in close proximity to each other, about 200 feet below the location of the cedar tree, near a small stream. They hadn't been discovered with the others in March because they were buried under 20 to 30 feet of snow. If the discovery of the first 5 bodies had revealed tragic but seemingly straightforward circumstances of hypothermic death, the scene of the final 4 hikers' resting place revealed chaos and horror. At the outset of this part of the story, I highly recommend consulting the work of the noted authors. Each of their books have more detailed summaries of the autopsies. Svetlana Oss also created a translation from the Russian language of the official autopsy reports, the Dyatlov Pass Post-Mortem. It contains only the autopsy reports and no extraneous theories as to specific causes. As the ski hikers were discovered, the autopsies on their bodies were carried out in the village of Vizhe between March 4th and May 9th, 1959. On March 4th, the procedure was performed on Doroshenko, Krivonishenko, Dyatlov, and Kolmogorova. On March 8th, Slobodin's autopsy was completed soon after his body was found. The remaining autopsies for Dubinina, Zolotaryov, Thibault-Brunel, and Kolovatov were carried out on May 9, 1959. The official cause of death for all of the Dyatlov group was listed as hypothermia, hastened in some of the cases by the violence of the trauma causing the internal injuries. The stomach contents from all of the bodies indicated that the last food consumed, a cold meal since there was no evidence of the stove having been set up that night, approximately 6 to 8 hours prior to death. If the group ate their last meal at about 6 p.m., that would place the time of death at sometime around 2 a.m. on February 2nd. When taken together, the findings on first read indicate that the hikers had made some poor choices and suffered the consequences. In the investigation, Dyatlov, as group leader, was in fact the person held officially responsible for the tragedy because he was A, the group leader, B, he was responsible for changing the intended original route, and C, he did not prevent the subsequent chaos and trauma that occurred in the morning hours of February 2nd. Such is the weight and accountability of leadership. However, and this is where the story takes its turn down the road of strangeness, a closer read of the actual autopsy reports suggests that the hikers, all of them, suffered from varying degrees of inflicted trauma not associated with freezing to death. In the cases of Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, Krivonishenko, and Doroshenko, various abrasions, bruising, and swelling of the faces, lips, eyes, hands, legs, and torso were noted, some of which no doubt occurred in the terminal struggles to stay alive while freezing to death. But some of the injuries, mostly minor compared to the second group of 4, may have also occurred as the result of personal struggles with adversaries. With whom or what adversarial force, if that is true, remains a mystery. Krivonishenko and Doroshenko had burn marks that are assumed to have occurred when they were trying to warm themselves at the fire as they died under the cedar tree. Slobodin exhibited similar abrasions and bruising, but he had also sustained a skull fracture at some point after leaving the tent. Dubinina, Zolotaryov, Kolovatov, and Thibault-Brunel were located in close proximity to each other below the cedar tree, near a stream, and near the makeshift snow shelter they were trying to create. 2 of this group suffered crushing chest wounds and fractured skulls. Their internal injuries were described as looking as if they had been hit by a vehicle traveling at speed. In other words, they received severe, blunt force trauma from directed, overwhelming force. Stranger still, the internal trauma to these four did not have corresponding wound areas or the severe bruising on the outer surfaces of the skin that would be expected to match the blunt force trauma of the internal injuries. All in all, the total volume of wounds, great and small, and the locations and positions of the bodies indicated that a violent struggle between the members of the group and an unknown adversary may have occurred after leaving the tent. It should be noted that Luda Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov sustained the worst injuries of the group. Both had multiple fractures of their ribs. Luda's tongue and supporting muscle tissue was missing from her mouth, as were her upper lip tissue and eyeballs. Zolotaryov had similar injuries, but his tongue was intact. Of course, it is possible that the degree of soft tissue damage to Luda and Semyon was simply the result of natural processes. The four bodies of the second group were in a relatively wet environment in or near the stream that would have hastened decomposition of soft tissues. That being said, in the final analysis, after all the bodies were found and the autopsies performed, the central questions still remained then, as they do to this day. What had happened in the early hours of the morning to force the group to either slash their way out of the tent or for the tent to be torn open from the outside? What had the hikers encountered that would have them risk freezing to death by going into the harsh elements outside without their winter clothing and footwear? And what had happened at or near the makeshift snow shelter to inflict the severe trauma to Luda, Semyon, Nikolai, and Alexander? There have been many theories offered over the decades about what occurred on the night of February 1st, 1959, on Kholat Syakhl in the Russian Ural Mountains that killed the 9 members of the Dyatlov ski hiking group. The hypotheses range from the completely absurd to models of the causes of incident that make sense but cannot be proven. Perhaps the best investigative tool that you can utilize in your own search for the what happened part of the missing puzzle piece is the application of Occam's razor. After considering the known facts, the simplest theory that accounts for them is probably the correct one. That being said, all reasonable theories of cause seem to at least agree on this set of facts. I mention them here so they do not have to be repeated. From January 23rd, the start of the ski hiking trip, to January 28th of 1959, the progress of the Dyatlov group was unremarkable. They were in high spirits and were adjusting well to the rigors of the trip before them. On the 28th, one of the party left the group to return to Sverdlovsk due to a painful flare-up of an old back injury. The remaining hikers continued the trip. 4.5 days later, on February 1st, the members of the Dyatlov ski hiking group had changed their route from Mount Otorten and stopped instead on Kholat Syakhl to pitch their tent at about 4 p.m. Sometime after 7 p.m., all of the group fled their tent during the night with temperatures approaching 20 degrees below zero with wind and blowing snow. The tent, which was the only safe shelter available to the group, was either cut open from the inside by the hikers to speed their escape, or the side of the tent was ripped or cut open from the outside by something or someone forcing the hikers out. In any case, the tent was virtually destroyed. Now, there was no blood evidence on the inside walls of the tent or on the personal property left behind inside it or outside on the fabric of the tent or the snow around it. The hikers escaped into the frigid night, clad mostly in light clothing and wearing only socks on their feet. They left behind all personal belongings, heavy clothing, boots and shoes, and food. The group did not have firearms or other weapons with them on the ski hike. According to the toxicology reports from the autopsies, none of the group had been drinking alcohol or taking behavior-altering drugs. Searchers discovered a series of footprints in a couple of locations preserved in the snow, which seemed to suggest that the hikers were not running, but instead were moving downslope to the forested area in an orderly fashion. The full group of 9 hikers had at least made it together to the cedar tree at the edge of the forested area, about a mile downslope from their destroyed tent on Kholat Syakhl. A small fire was started under the cedar tree. There was evidence to suggest that one or more of the hiking group had climbed up the tree and removed some small branches for the fire. They may have also been attempting to climb the tree to either escape from whatever or whomever they were fleeing from, or use the height from the tree to observe the area around them. Sometime in the next hour or so after arriving at the tree, Georgy Krivanashenko and Yuri Doroshenko died from exposure and hypothermia. They were likely the first members of the group to die. At that point, some of the remaining members may have removed and shared articles of clothing from the dead men. The remaining group then split up, with one group of 3 trying to return to the tent and the other group of 4 trying to create a temporary shelter in the snow. Dyatlov, Slobodin, and Kolmogorova had tried to return to the tent but died from hypothermia while moving upslope in a single-file line. The 3 had bruises and abrasions on their hands, and Slobodin had also suffered a skull fracture. Both Slobodin and Dyatlov had abrasions on the knuckles of their hands that the autopsy reports identified as being consistent with those received in a fistfight. While they may have started out closer together as they attempted to return to the tent, the group were found 300 to 500 feet apart individually. The second group of 4 members, consisting of Luda Dubanina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Alexander Kolovatov, and Nikolai Thibault Brenol, had died from a combination of internal injuries and hypothermia. The internal injuries were severe and the result of an unknown blunt force trauma described by Lev Ivanov as occurring from overwhelming force. This group of hikers were all located about 160 feet below the cedar tree in a small ravine with a stream running through it. The 4 bodies were very near to each other. The hikers were discovered 2 months after the others due to being buried under a heavy snow accumulation in the ravine. The 4 bodies were either lying beside or directly in the stream under the snow, which hastened the process of decomposition. There were no external surface wounds that matched up with their internal injuries. The severe internal injuries to the 4 members of the second group occurred at about the same time, while they were working to finish the snow den for protection from the weather. And that's the summary of facts that can, for the most part, fit all of the 4 major theories that we're going to be looking at. The first serious hypotheses, and initially the most popular theory about what drove the group from the tent, was speculation of a possible avalanche. But the degree of slope on Kholat Syakhl is about 18 degrees and does not support the idea of a large, crushing avalanche. At the time of the tent's discovery, there was also the lack of evidence of the snow rush and debris aftermath that is typical of an avalanche. Also, the end of the tent was upright, and it was only collapsed in the center section with a few inches of snow covering that section. The avalanche idea was discarded officially early on in the investigation in 1959, although some continue to think that this is still the best solution. The infrasound theory as a possible solution is developed in detail in Donnie Icar's book, Dead Mountain. Infrasound is sound that occurs at a frequency at or below 20 Hz or cycles per second and is typically not within the range of normal hearing. The infrasound frequency can be generated accidentally by mechanical means from the vibrations of equipment or artificially created and directed through machines designed to create an infrasound frequency. But infrasound frequencies can also be generated naturally as wind passes over and around certain shapes like buildings or mountains, creating infrasonic waves. In this configuration, it is associated with what is called the Kármán vortex street phenomenon. Generally, infrasound is not dangerous until it is being generated at about 7 cycles per second. At that level, some individuals may experience no ill effects whatsoever, while others may experience some general discomfort like headaches and nausea, and still others can have severe panic attacks and exhibit extreme paranoia. As it turns out, Kolatsyakal has the right dome shape, and, under the right conditions, with the wind blowing over and around the mountain and moving down slope, could create the right conditions to generate the Kármán vortex street and infrasound at the 7 cycles per second frequency. It would work this way. The wind, at high velocity, pushes into the mountain. It then separates into 2 side streams, passing around the dome shape, with the 2 streams generating a series of small, tornado-like vortices on either side. If one were in a tent located on the downslope lee side of the mountain, precisely the location of the Dyatlov group's tent, one would be in a perfect position to experience the very worst sound combination comprised of the wind, the vortices, and the infrasound frequency. In short, on one level, you would hear something akin to the roar and shriek of jet engines on top of you, while on another level, you are being bathed in an infrasound frequency that, at least for some, could create abject terror and abandonment of rational behavior. With all of that in combination, it would be a perfect, horrific storm of sound elements that would not be recognized as wind artifact, but rather might be thought to be the sound of an avalanche in progress. Under those circumstances, an irrational response to what is being heard might influence members of the group to attempt a panicked escape from the tent from whatever they were imagining was happening. It would be a terror-filled survival flight response, leading to cutting out the side of the tent to escape instead of taking the time trying to open the secured front entrance. In fear for their lives, the group exited without dressing in proper clothing or footwear, moved down the mountain, and stopped at the cedar tree about a mile below the tent. It was pitch black at that time, with a fierce wind and blowing snow, and a temperature of at least minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit. By the time they reached the cedar tree, the first signs of hypothermia had probably begun. A small fire was started. One or more of the group climbed the cedar tree to break off small branches for fuel. The fire, though, was insufficient to keep the group warm. Within an hour or so from the time the fire was started, 2 members of the Dyatlov group had died from hypothermia, and the remaining group then split up. Dyatlov, Zina, and Slobodin elected to try and return to the tent. Luda Dubanina, Alexander Kolovatov, Semyon Zolotaryov, and Nikolai Thibault-Brunel moved a short distance below the cedar tree toward the ravine with a small stream to try and build a dugout shelter. Igor Dyatlov, Zina Kolmogorova, and Rustem Slobodin attempted to get back to the tent. They were walking upslope, single file, but did not make it back to the tent and died from hypothermia where they fell. Luda Dubanina, Alexander Kolovatov, Semyon Zolotaryev, and Nikolai Thibault-Brunel may have sustained their internal injuries by falling off a bankment over the ravine in the dark and onto the rocks next to the stream. The next theory, laid out by author Keith McCloskey in his second book, Journey to Dyatlov Pass, is that the group was killed accidentally from aerial explosives during a Soviet military exercise. In this solution, The Dyatlov group has set up their tent and then retired for their meal and for the night. One or two members, possibly Semyon Zolotaryov and Georgy Krivanashenko, step back outside for a comfort break. They notice some lights in the sky, probably flares, being dropped to illuminate the exercise. Semyon and Georgy go back in the tent and retrieve their cameras, telling the others about what they are seeing. For the sake of clarity, it should be noted that the frames shown here were first thought to be lens flares and other lens artifact or defects. The frames were then scanned and microscopically examined by Valentin Yakomenko and can better be seen at his and Keith McCloskey's websites. In his analysis, Yakomenko suggests that the lights are not film defects or lens artifacts. Rather, they actually show something in the sky that is approaching the Dyatlov group location, but the photos are not properly exposed due to the darkness and camera settings. In this context, the lights are rightfully identified as UFOs, but in the proper sense of being unidentified flying objects, but not as something with an extraterrestrial origin. The photos of the lights were probably taken by Semyon Zolotaryov and Georgy Krivanashenko. Several members of the group then join Semyon and Georgy, who begin snapping a few photos. One of the photos is taken, perhaps by Krivanashenko, who is behind the others, and in the bottom of the frame captures the shadows of the back of their heads looking up. It was frigid for the lightly dressed group, and the gathering thins out as people begin returning to the relative warmth and protection of the tent. A few more pictures are snapped, at which point a nearby aerial explosive detonates. Rustam Slobodin, who is still outside, is knocked down from the blast wave and receives his skull fracture. Dazed, confused, and shell-shocked, everyone panics as chaos ensues, and the hikers who are in the tent cut their way out in a bid to escape and get out of the area as quickly as possible. They all move downslope toward the tree line below, assisting Slobodin as best they can. The group arrives at the cedar tree. The frigid weather is already taking its toll as Krivanashenko and Doroshenko work listlessly to gather material along with the others to build the small fire. Now suffering the debilitating effects of hypothermia, Georgy and Yuri try to warm themselves at the fire and unintentionally burn their hands and feet from insertion into the fire as they freeze to death. Within the hour, both are dead. The remaining members split into two groups. Dyatlov, Slobodin, and Kolmogorova, in single file, attempt to return to the tent. Their single file line begins to stretch out. Zina nearly reaches the goal, but all three die as the sub-zero weather freezes them where they fall. As the first group were struggling to return to the wrecked tent, the second group, consisting of Luda Dubanina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Alexander Kolovatov, and Nikolai Thibault Brunel, moved to a point further down from the cedar tree by about 160 feet. They begin to dig out an emergency snow shelter above a small stream. There is another explosion nearly on top of them. Their relative positions as the blast wave hits them determine the severity of their injuries. Luda falls into the face of the rock she is standing near, and Semyon falls just below that point. Both were hit full front on by the pressure of the blast, and their chests are crushed. Nikolai is smacked into the rocks and suffers a massive skull fracture. Alexander suffers a broken neck and ankle. All four are found within feet of each other and are either in or by the stream. If they were not killed outright, the hypothermic conditions would have hastened the end quickly. The emergency snow shelter is never utilized. There are variations on this theme. One of them suggests that the KGB, who were involved in all levels of the Soviet government at that time, knew that the hikers had all been killed during a military weapons test. After being informed of the accident, they ordered the scene altered and had a team or teams physically reset the placement of the bodies to where they were later found by the search and recovery teams. Once the bodies were found by the search teams, the investigation was ordered closed, and hiking permits for the route to Mount O'Torton would not be issued again for nearly 4 years. The final theory is put forth by Svetlana Oss and suggests that the Dyatlov group was murdered, perhaps by Mansi or members of one of the smaller indigenous tribes in the area, like the Ostyaks, due to possible infringement into a sacred area. As noted earlier, the Mansi tribe have been in the Ural Mountains for many generations, but they are Russian citizens and many have Russian names. The Mansi are considered to be a peaceful and friendly people who keep to themselves and do subsistence farming and are known to be experienced hunters and trackers. They participated in the search and recovery of the Dyatlov group's bodies. There are photos taken with the group cameras during the hike of Mansi tree signs, and there are several photos of Mansi hunters who are assisting with the search effort. By the time the Dyatlov investigation was shut down by order of Moscow, the Mansi had been exonerated as possible suspects. But there was also a behind-the-scenes suspicion then and now that there was more to the story of an indigenous tribe attacking the group than what had been officially reported at the time of the investigation. The Ostyak tribe are a very small indigenous group that live in the Ural Mountains area. They are an aboriginal subset to the Mansi and tend to be much more isolated. As a tribe, they are not desirous of mixing with anyone who is not in their tribal domain. They are exceptional trackers and hunters. There are professional credentialed investigators who today consider the most likely cause of the fatal Dyatlov incident to be an accidental infringement by the group onto an Ostyak sacred area. There are tribally designated sacred areas on O'Torton and Kholat Syakhl. Forget cultural equality. The sites are sacred enough that Mansi and Ostyak women are not allowed to even look upon them. If there were an accidental and unknown infringement by the Dyatlov group into a sacred tribal area, it would make absolutely no difference that the women in question were Luda Dubinina and Zina Kolmogorova. The response to such an encroachment might very well have been harsh. There may also have been a suspicion by the Ostyaks that the group were going to hunt their protected game or attempt to steal an Ostyak treasure cache. In this scenario, the Dyatlov hikers are pretty much in the same configuration as in the military weapons accident. 2 of the men are outside snapping a few photos of the lights in the sky. The lights, perhaps from a military exercise, are only coincidental and do not figure in as to what follows. Unbeknown to them, the hikers had already sealed their fates by unwittingly entering a tribally protected area. A group of Ostyak hunters who had been following and observing the Dyatlov group since their arrival into the tribal area surrounded and closed in on the tent. Semyon Zolotaryev and Georgy Krivanashenko, who are already outside taking photos of the lights in the sky, are taken captive. What is different here is that the tent is then breached from the outside and cut open by the Ostyak hunters. The surprised group of hikers in the tent are herded outside without intentionally being allowed to take their heavier clothing or footwear. The intent is to allow the weather to act as the weapon to kill the intruders. While huddled together outside the tent, Dyatlov, Krivanashenko, and perhaps Rustam Slobodin and others attempt to defend themselves. Rustam receives a blunt force blow to his head and his skull is fractured. The group is quickly overwhelmed and subdued by a superior force and the weather. Dyatlov and his fellow hikers, who are assisting Rustam, who is groggy from his head injury, are pushed by their attackers to descend the slope and move to the forested tree line at the bottom. During this period, the hunters may have maintained their distance, wanting instead to observe and leave the harsh elements to do the killing business naturally. Down at the cedar tree, the group builds the fire and assesses its situation over the next hour. During this time, Krivanashenko and Doroshenko succumb to the elements. Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Rustam Slobodin attempt to return to the tent. Luda, Alexander, Semyon, and Nikolai decide to try and build a snow den shelter down from the cedar tree and near the creek to survive the night. At some point, while working on the shelter, the group of 4 were attacked again and killed. It is possible that the internal chest injuries, consisting of the symmetrical rib fractures to Luda and Semyon, were caused when hunters intentionally stepped on or sat forcefully upon their chests. All other injuries could have been caused by the struggle and by blunt force trauma. In the nearly 3 months before the discovery of their bodies, some of the corpses slid into the water, where the decomposition was hastened. Up on the slope, Dyatlov, Rustam, and Zina had started out from the cedar tree close together in their single-file line, but stress from their injuries and the frigid weather conditions took a toll, and as their energy ebbed away, the distance between them increased. Each died and froze in the place of their last steps. As a final note to this theory, a question that surfaces is why the substantial amount of personal possessions that were left at the tent and the extra cache of food and supplies stored at the bottom of the mountain for the return trip, all of which would be useful and perhaps even prized, were not taken by the attackers. It's a good and reasonable question. A possible answer, and one that I personally like, is that the attackers were a lot smarter than given their due. They simply decided that keeping any of the Dyatlov gear, supplies, and money would greatly increase the risk of connecting them to the crime of murder. And that summarizes the 4 main theories that account for the Dyatlov Pass incident. This Lens on Life project video is built on the research efforts of Svetlana Oss, Keith McCloskey, and Donnie Ikar. It is intended to be an introductory journey into one of the great mysteries and tragedies of the 20th century. All of the noted books are available as ebooks or can be ordered in paperback format from Amazon. While each author has come to different conclusions as to the cause of the fatal events that overtook the Dyatlov group on its ski hike to Mount Otorten in 1959, each of the scenarios is reasonable and is meticulously researched. I have, of course, arrived at my own favorite theory about the Dyatlov incident, but do not include personal comments about it in this summary. Since there can be no definitive solution to the mystery, your own conclusions will be every bit as valid as my own. Each of the 4 solutions represented in this presentation recognize the difficulty in building a factual scenario nearly 60 years after the incident occurred. In short, there is no smoking gun, which is to say that anytime you hear a program weigh in that states the mystery of the Dyatlov incident has been solved, take heed. It probably hasn't. What will be important for your personal journey is to be guided by the wisdom of Occam's razor, the simplest theory supporting the known facts as being the most likely correct solution. But while you are thinking about the mystery of the Dyatlov incident, what I would really like for you to take away from this Lens on Life project is this. Nearly 60 years ago, on January 23, 1959, Igor Dyatlov, Luda Dubanina, Rustam Slobodin, Alexander Kolovatov, Nikolai Thibault Brunel, Semyon Zolotaryov, Yuri Doroshenko, Zina Kolmogorova, Georgy Krivanashenko, and Yuri Yudin set out for several weeks of fun-filled and challenging ski hiking as a break from their studies at Ural Polytech Institute. As they set out, the group was healthy, fit, well-provisioned, and experienced. 10 days later, and sometime after 7 p.m. on February 1, 1959, in frigid weather conditions and mysterious circumstances, the flames of life for 9 of the Dyatlov hiking group were snuffed out. The Dyatlov group were real people. They each had a full life of dreams and destinations in front of them. All of them were friends who loved music and singing. 2 played mandolin. 1 was a decorated veteran. 2 were testing the potential of a romantic relationship. 1 would probably have become an inventor and famous applications engineer. All of them were well educated, intelligent, and at the doorway of professional careers. And then there were none. So as you consider the mystery of the Dyatlov incident, please stop occasionally to take a moment to remember the Dyatlov group as human beings, and not just puzzle pieces on a large-scale gaming board like Clue. As for me, the Dyatlov incident remains now and probably forever a haunting mystery. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Michael's Lens on Life project.